Welcome to The Family Skeptical, Parenting Through Non-Belief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of non-believer who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have. So be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you. So, hey, Pops, it feels like it feels like a long time since you recorded one of these.
Yeah, it does, because we have taken a bit of a break.
So on our last episode, I said that I hoped we wouldn't have to return to the topic of abortion or the overturning of Roe. And I don't really want to do that. But, trigger warning, I do want to say one thing about the case of the 10-year-old in Ohio who had to leave to get an abortion. So the only thing I want to say is that the thing I found most shocking about that case was that people were surprised a 10-year-old would need an abortion. And I just wanted to put it out there that child sexual abuse is something we really need to talk about more. And I've been thinking about the best way to address it on this show. And one thing that was on my mind even before that case is how books for teens and young people address it. I've been reading a couple of puberty books with Reader, and I find it interesting how even some of the more progressive books try to talk about child sexual abuse. So just kind of a heads up that that's something I would like to address in the future, because at least given my experience, and I am lucky that I never had to experience that, but given the number of people I love who have, it's a really big problem. And the fact that people are shocked that children are experiencing the repercussions of it just says to me, we need to talk about it even more. So it may take me a little while. I don't know if I want to get an expert necessarily on the podcast to talk about it, but I would like to double check my thinking on what I've been reading with somebody who's a little bit more expert. So it could take me a while to pull it together. But just a heads up that clearly there is more we need to talk about here, and I hope we'll have a chance to do it. But that's not what we're going to be talking about today.
No.
Not at all.
No.
Our first topic is something I actually wanted to talk about for a long time. And I'm really excited about this episode because for the first topic and the second, they are both things where I only have questions.
Right on.
I am coming in with very little advice and just a lot to explore. So the New York Times recently had a piece by Catherine Pearson on June 28th, 2022, entitled How to Raise Kids Who Are Good at Getting Angry. And we'll put a link in the show notes. And more than this piece, it was a reminder to me that anger is something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. So, Pops, what did you think of the article?
I mean, I read it from the standpoint of a parent who has one child, in this case, Reader, who has a tendency, or at least until relatively recently, had a tendency to have those quote unquote moments of big feelings, which would lead perhaps to the slamming of doors, hiding under beds, throwing things, screaming, just a difficult time processing and having actions that you would consider productive. I'm not talking about stifling the outburst, but just managing it better. And I'm also approaching it as a parent who, until recently, wasn't very effective at managing his own anger. And we'll get into that because that was one of my big takeaways when it came to the article. But I found myself agreeing with a lot of it. Like the gist that I take away from the article is that it is very important to not put up a barrier between a kid and expressing themselves emotionally. What's important is helping them to manage their actions, and that ultimately those actions will have consequences. The emotionality should not be quote unquote criminalized in a household, because that's just going to teach the kid to deal with their emotions in perhaps an unproductive or even a damaging way. Instead, looking to say, okay, I understand this is how you're feeling. This is why the action that you want to take as a result of that feeling might not be the best thing to do at this moment. So I also approach this with a certain degree of nuance, like ways that actions can be performed can be positive or negative, and not just the actions themselves. Like a child who has an issue with hitting when they get frustrated or angry, that can be directed towards hitting, say, a punching bag you have set up in the kid's room or a playroom or the basement. So I just found it really interesting, and I immediately found myself nodding in agreement and thinking of all the different ways that we have had, both in my own life and then with our kids, have had to cope with this and have found solutions that have worked for us, at least for us as a family.
Yeah, I was thinking about Reader. In the beginning, it says that toddler tantrums are usually around 3 minutes, though they can go from 1 to 20 minutes. It was a moment of like, well, no, because he used to come home from daycare and you weren't around at this time. And he would scream and refuse to be touched for like 30 minutes every day we got home.
I don't think you ever told me that.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, I was really dealing with something.
Did you like bury that and just never talk about it?
No, I mean, I don't know. It didn't feel like there was a lot to talk about. It was just something to get through.
I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Did you feel like it was something that you had been doing as a parent? Like, did you go through that moment of like grief or shame analysis? Like, what am I doing wrong as a parent that's making my child act this way?
No, I think
that's good.
I think the hard thing, which has always been a little bit difficult with Reader, is that the tools that I would respond to and the tools that I felt like I had to use were just completely ineffectual.
That'd be too easy.
So I think it was more just, I didn't feel responsible, but I did. Well, I don't know if I felt bad that I didn't have a way to solve it. It just felt confusing. And in the end, it just really seemed like he needed time. So that's what I gave him. And I just sat with him. But
how long did it take for you to get from him first exhibiting this behavior to you coming up with the solution? Oh, I just need to give him time. Do you remember?
I have no idea.
Like how was what you're talking about? Like first day, first week, 3 months?
Probably the first couple of weeks.
Well, hey, kudos on finding a solution. That can be frustrating.
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe there was like more I should have been doing. This is, and so I love your question about whether I felt guilty or, kind of the emotions around it, because while I agreed with everything in the article, it didn't seem to quite encapsulate, I think, the intensity of parent emotion around this topic.
That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah.
Because it was talking about the kids, what happened to do with the kids. The kids get emotional, do this with the kids. But ultimately, the guiding light in the situation isn't going to be the kid and hoping for the best with their response. It's going to be, what does the parent do?
Yeah. And I just, on parent message boards and other things, there's very little that comes with as much sort of guilt and second guessing as getting angry around kids.
Yes.
I feel like this is just such a complex area. And for me, I have a bit of a weird relationship to this because, well, one, I feel like a lot of parents come at this feeling like their parents maybe exhibited too much anger, where they want to break the cycle.
Mm-hmm. And I've talked to a bunch of people who are exactly like that.
Show
and
less to
with good reason.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah, with good reason.
When I was growing up, my parents were almost never angry with me. Mm-hmm. Like almost never. And part of that is that I was just an incredibly peculiar child. I'm sure I did things that were frustrating. I mean, all kids do, but I was very well behaved. I was very focused and could focus on an activity for a long time. In some ways, I acted very adult before I was, when I was still quite young. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't somebody who was like raising hell a lot. Mm-hmm. But they were also just, I think it was also just something about them. They almost never seemed to get angry, which is fine. But I can remember the one or two times that one of my parents got angry with me. And it wasn't terrible. Like it wasn't, I don't think those moments were particularly negative or outsized, but they had a huge impact on me just because it never happened. Mm-hmm. So they felt scary, I think, because I just didn't sort of have tools to deal with that or know how to deal with it. And I feel like into my 20s, I had a really hard time whenever anybody expressed anger. And it was actually, I can remember senior year of college having a disagreement with my roommate and he got very angry. I don't know if that's true. I think that's even a mischaracterization. He just got angry.
Probably. Yeah.
And it was the first time where I didn't just like cave into myself and back down. And I stood my ground and wasn't scared. And it felt like a huge accomplishment. And because of that, I haven't, and anger is a funny word, right? Because it can encompass a wide range of emotion that maybe there are better words for, and it's better to break it down into parts. But I pretty consciously did not want to shield our kids from all anger. But maybe I mean more frustration.
Okay.
But yeah, I think I went, from that experience, I think I went into parenting wanting them to feel okay when people expressed anger. But I don't know if I've done that right at all. Really don't. Did you have any specific thoughts about it going into parenting, or was it something that only sort of came up when you were in the situation?
About anger specifically?
Yeah, or big emotions or
no,
anything
I
related?
honestly, neither. I had not given a lot of thought to whether or not our kids would be have big emotions, whether or not I would deal with them very well. It was just like with everything else, I just sort of submitted myself to the journey and accepted that whatever would happen would happen. Now, whether or not that was a good idea at the time is up for debate. But in the process of being a parent, I have learned both the value in the boys seeing me being emotional, but also how to better manage my own emotions and how to help them beyond that. Even more importantly, how to help them better manage theirs, not to stuff them away or lock them down or whatever, but to identify that they're being emotional, to identify what they're being emotional about, to try to look objectively at what it is they're being emotional about as much as possible in the moment, and then choose actions that aren't necessarily fully driven by the emotion. That's one thing I talk about with the reader a lot, and something that Go has picked up on is that when you're feeling a big emotion, you're not required to react to the emotional state in any specific way. Like if you're angry or frustrated with somebody, you're not required to lash out at them because you're angry. You're not required to meet force with force. Like because somebody made them angry doesn't mean that they have to do that quote unquote anger back at that person. They can choose to do something totally unrelated, something like almost a tangential choice. Like, for instance, what I talk about with them would be, oh, that makes you angry. Like your brother made you angry. You can choose to hug him and say, I understand. Please don't do it again. You don't have to take like a block and throw it at his head. It's not a requirement to act in any specific way. And that was one, and that since that's something we already been doing with the boys, or at least something I've already been doing with the boys, I thought it was interesting to read this article and say, oh yeah, I'm not alone in thinking this. I'm not alone in understanding the value in seeing multiple paths forward out of an emotional situation instead of letting the kids stew and just kind of come up with whatever the emotion dictates.
Do you feel anything particularly gendered around anger? Because I think I feel like men are given a lot more permission to be angry than women.
I think there are two things there. There's that, and then there's also that men are not, I think, socially as well equipped to deal with the anger. Like it's almost like this idiotic double-edged sword where they're given all this like length of rope on which to hang themselves with their emotions, but they're not given a pair of scissors to cut the rope. Whereas women is sort of the opposite, where they're expected to have a greater sense of decorum, but also socially they're trained to better talk about their emotions and to process them. At least that's my 2 cents. And that was something else that, thank you for bringing that up. That was something else that I thought of reading this, is that we have 2 boys. And with that comes that boy baggage. If we had 2 girls, it might be totally different. It probably would be totally different.
Yeah. And I think I disagree with you a little bit, because we were getting ready to record and I was thinking about this. And I feel like with, I don't know. I feel like with sadness, women are more culturally allowed to express sadness. And I think they also have more tools for dealing with it because of that.
Right.
Anger, women culturally definitely are not allowed to express anger.
Oh, no.
But I don't know if that means they have better tools for it. I don't know if repression necessarily means they're dealing with it better.
No, what I'm saying is that there is, like, socially and culturally, that it is more common for women to discuss their emotions, and that it is more common for them to discuss their emotions with each other, and thus they have a means of processing them. Whereas with boys, it is not as socially or culturally permissible to talk about emotions. Boys do, and the world deals with it, is sort of like how it's always been, right? In patriarchal society, boys do, and then society just deals with consequences. Whereas like, it's not fair, obviously. And I would absolutely agree that different emotions are given different shrift per the genders. Like the whole adage about like boys crying, and all that sort of stuff. Like, it's not like there's definitely a gendered bias in that regard. But it is really something interesting to think about. And I think honestly, it is a cultural thing that in some cultures it's more permissible for one gender to do one thing or the other, which is, I think, a whole other box to unpack.
But I don't know how much women are talking about anger. I just don't know. Like I said, I think it gets confused in the wording. There's a podcast called The Super Mamas, which is two Latinx moms in Los Angeles who are also sisters. And they just recently, I just listened to it this morning. They had an episode about mom rage, which we'll also link to. And the guest they had on talked about how anger is often an expression of a different emotion. It's frustration or sadness, and then what comes out is anger. And so the frustration is often talked about with women, but I don't know if that sometimes expression of anger behind it. I don't know if women are talking about that, because I do think there's a lot of shame and resistance to even seeing that in ourselves. Like, I think I've learned to deal with anger better, but I was trying to think, like, I've tried to be I don't think I've ever like screamed at the boys, but that's because I just don't do that.
Right.
To anyone. Do you know what I mean? I would never scream at anyone. And so maybe more what I have been expressing is just frustration, which I think is also okay. But even that, like, every now and then the boys are like, "Oh, mom, you scared me," which, I don't know. That's not the response I want either. You know what I mean? It's very complex. I think anger might sometimes be sort of like a basket for a lot of other things that each
that's
need
why
to
talking is so important, because if you don't talk to your kids and actually listen to their responses, you're not going to learn what's really bothering them. Like, I had to do this professionally for a long time, as you know. Sometimes kids just want to be seen and heard, that it's very common for parents to elevate their own perceptions and their own responses over their children, because as parents, they quote unquote know best. And of course, as a result of that, whatever the kids are feeling or thinking is less important. Kids are brighter and more observant than a lot of adults give them credit for. And I think that part and parcel with that is they have an ability to, earlier than a lot of adults think, at least in my experience, and sure, this is anecdotal, but I've had to deal with a lot of other people's children over the years. So this isn't just like me and talking about my kids. That when you give them time to find the way to express what's really going on in their heads, they will. And it just takes a lot of patience. And so that also comes down to it. Like, we're talking about dealing with kids who are good at getting angry. And I said, part of that is the parent response. Part of that parent response is having the patience to let your kid work through it and then find a way to vocalize what's really going on, what's really under all of that emotion. Because if you can't do that, then you're going to shut down a lot of, not necessarily any, that's not fair, but a lot of the positive results that could come from even what would be otherwise considered a damaging outburst or a huge temper tantrum. Like, those are some of the more teachable moments where our kids have learned real wisdom because, and sure, fine, back patting commence, because we've given them the opportunity to think about things and to breathe through it and then talk about what's actually going on with them, to give them that moment of self-reflection that not a lot of adults even give themselves. And I think that if you can teach your kids to do that within themselves early, that just builds empathy, because then they start to realize, oh, if I need this and I gain benefit from it, even in just at a purely selfish level, if I allow somebody else the opportunity to do this when they're upset with me, maybe I can get a better result in our relationship. There's a lot to it. And I really do believe that it has to start with the parents, that whatever the kid is feeling or experiencing, or how they're reacting, or the severity of their outbursts or whatever. Like, I know it's easy for us to say because we don't have kids who do that sort of stuff, but it just takes sometimes time and a lot of patience. So I think that we as parents need to start with ourselves. Like, we need to be friends to ourselves first in order to be more effective parents. And that means emotionally, and not just like downtime where we get to read a book and unplug and not look at a screen or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's actually a really good transition into the next topic.
Okay.
If that's okay.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Because you brought up that we need to give kids more credit.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been
Is this going to be a point of disagreement?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay.
Yes, no. I think we should
go. Our children get nothing.
They're just little blobs and need to be formed. No. So
shackle them in a closet.
So we've been talking about the book, Relax, It's Just God, How and Why to Talk to Your Kids About Religion When You're Not Religious by Wendy Thomas Russell. And the next section I wanted to talk about is called The Inheritance of Anxiety. I want to read a couple sections. So this is about parents who may have bitterness around religion. And she gives a couple of examples from the book. First was a mother who told me that her young daughter once stormed out of her elementary school classroom, accusing the teacher of indoctrinating the class by telling them the Christian Easter story. I was very proud.
I'm visualizing that. That's actually pretty funny.
Yeah. I was very proud, the mother went on to say, that my child was so confident, assertive, and sure of her own non-belief that she was able to do this. Confident and assertive, yes, but sure of her own non-belief in elementary school? That's doubtful. Most likely, the child was simply repeating a myth she'd picked up at home, that talking about religious stories is a form of indoctrination. And then she gives another example too. This one, and now I'm reading from the book. This one involves a mother whose childhood in a strict Roman Catholic family left her emotionally scarred. As an adult, she spoke of her religious views pretty openly in her home, not realizing her strong opinions were getting filtered down to her children, all under the age of 8. The results were mortifying. My son, she told me, has expressed his hatred of religion in front of religious family members. Hatred, people, and the kid wasn't yet 9. It concerns me when I see parents raising their children, either accidentally or on purpose, to view religion, particularly Christianity, as a personal threat. So I had a lot of questions about these two sections.
Okay.
And it's a little bit hard because in the specific of both these stories, I think she could be totally right, if that makes any sense. Like that, how young was the first girl?
Oh, no, I totally agree. I think the first anecdote was funny, but I totally agree that that a child that young wouldn't necessarily have worked through all the metaphysics, all the philosophical ramifications of non-belief, acquired some sort of like epistemic foundation wherein they're confident that in like a negative proposition and are able to like elucidate it to a classroom. I highly doubt that it's anything other than the kid picking up on how the parents talk. And yeah, so yeah.
Well, that definitely could be the case. It could just be a kid parroting what they heard at home.
Or they're a philosophical genius at the age of 6.
No, so okay, there's a middle ground.
It's not impossible.
There's a middle ground. So when we were talking before about reading the Bible with kids, and I told that story about Go, how when we got to the part about God killing the firstborn, Go said, oh, but I thought God was good. And I had to think, because I never had that reaction as a child. I never had a problem with God doing terrible things in the Old Testament.
Well, you also liked Edward Gorey when you were a kid, so let's be fair.
Yeah, okay, true. but I don't think that's why. Thinking about it, I think the reason I never had a problem is because I always read it as a myth. It never even occurred to me that God could be real. So I wasn't treating that character like a good, all-powerful being. I was reading it as a myth because it seemed so certain to me that it wasn't true. It was just one of the stories we tell. And if you look at myths, they're all based on people, and we are complex and we do bad things. And, like nothing seemed weird about it because I felt entirely certain that what I was reading was simply a story. And that was from like a really young age. So I guess I just worry about putting too many bounds on what kids can feel like they know in their own life. Is an elementary school student going to have grappled with every argument against religion or for religion? No, of course not, right? But can that child have a full sense of their world where they might have felt like that was an inappropriate action? I think they could have.
Yeah, if you view it from a sense of like justice. The other thing you want to think about is that if their parents talk to their kids about politics, like we sometimes do, and the idea of justice, fairness, equal protection, a pluralistic society, having school where the kid has a sense of, oh, this is a revered place where we all learn things that we share, all these beliefs that we share. And here's this story that's from a mythos that my family does not share. And so this isn't right. This shouldn't be taught in school. There is another place for this, but it's not here. Like I could see that idea of fairness also being a part of it, because we all know kids love fair.
Yeah. And also we don't know kind of how the teacher was telling the story.
Exactly. It could have been an overreaction on the kid's part, or it could have been proselytizing on the teacher's part, because that happens.
Yeah. And also, if it had been a Jewish student, would we look at it differently?
Yeah. Well, I mean, any non-believer is a non-believer. It could be a Hindu student.
Oh, yeah,
right?
sure. Or a Muslim.
Could be a Wiccan family. It doesn't matter. As long as it's not a Christian, because we talk about non-believers, but
oh yeah, everybody's a non-believer.
Everybody's a non-believer of something. You know what I mean? So, what is it? It's like the Ricky Gervais says, like, all those gods you don't believe in. Well, I just don't believe in one more. That whole thing. So yeah, there's a lot of gray area in an anecdote like that, because we know the result, we know the setup, and we know the punchline, but it seems like there's a bigger story there. And without that, it's all just conjecture on our part. I think we should move on to the second one of those anecdotes that you read.
Yeah, which I think is even more interesting. I read that, and I think my feeling was, if the religious experiences truly left his mom scarred, I think it's okay if he hates that version of religion. That seems to me like a logical, empathetic response.
To an extent, I think that, again, going back to the idea of parents processing their emotions, self-reflection, as I said before, there should be no expectation that adults are any better at doing this than kids. It's a difficult thing looking back on things that bother us, whether big or small, whether it's actual trauma or just something that bugs us. And to have the ability to like fully process it, to gain wisdom from it and integrate that wisdom, that is a big ask. And obviously, the more traumatic the situation, the more perilous that journey can be, because you're forced to live and relive and relive and remember and all of that, these things that truly potentially damaged you, deeply damaged you. Your idea of what it is to trust and to love, like things that in a child's mind shouldn't be questioned. You're forced to go back and see how those things that should have been just assumed in a relationship were false. Like that can be a very difficult thing for an adult to do. And so,
that's so interesting that it's actually harder on the adult because the clarity of the child's vision. And the child's
the child's just reacting to the adult's emotional state. The child's not benefiting from any potential processing that the adult did or did not do. And so that's why, like I said before, it's important as adults to look for ways that we can seek to process these things. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, but it is some, like, I've seen the benefits of when I've done this. And so moving forward, my goal is to do this as often as possible with these moments in my life. So at the very least, I can try to avoid making the same mistake twice, but also so I can teach my kids to avoid making those mistakes at all. So they can be better than I am now earlier in life is my goal, for them to exceed me. That would be great if they did that. I would feel like I'm a successful parent if they did that. And part and parcel to that is this processing of emotion. And so in the second story, that kid having this vehement vitriolic reaction to the mere idea of Christianity is understandable, and you got to empathize with it. But then my big question is, where does that family go from there? Are they happy with feeling that way? Or would they rather seek to reconcile those emotions so they're not ruled by this anger? It's something that pervades, in the West especially, that pervades many people's daily lives. Our friends, family members, they're going to be members of this group that we're going to constantly find ourselves facing. Does it make your life better being that angry, even if you're justified in having that anger? That's the important thing. It's like, are we required to react in a set way? I don't think we are, right? Like if families of murder victims can, to a prisoner in death row, truly forgive that prisoner, and then release themselves from that cycle of anger and hate and bile, then I think anybody can. I'm not saying it's easy, and not everybody is going to get there. But I think that we owe it to ourselves to at least try. And maybe I'm just being like Pollyanna-ish or woo-woo, and this is my version of spirituality, and you can just throw it into the bin.
No.
But I really do believe that one of the things that has made me not only a better person, but a happier person and a better parent, better friend, and a better son and a father is this ability to be more honest about who I am, how I got here, and how I feel on a day-to-day basis. It's why I journal. I love journaling. It lets me unpack everything.
I think you're making a couple assumptions, though, because we don't know if he was vitriolic. I couldn't remember what it came from, but going back to our past conversation about
hate is a big word.
It is a big word.
Hate is a big word.
But just hear me out.
Okay, sure.
Going back to the conversation on anger, I was trying to think what it was, and maybe I'll come up with it and I'll plug it on the next episode. But I was listening to something else that talked about it. And I realized that I think there is something very different about the kind of anger that comes out at other people.
Mm-hmm.
And for lack of a better term, like righteous anger.
What does that mean?
And,
like discontent at the universe or some sort of like a social injustice.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And I think those are two different things.
That's more like frustration, right?
Right.
Like you can't control what it is that's making you angry. You have no direct connection to it. So you feel like there's nothing you can do. And so it's like a feedback loop.
Maybe not, though, because I think there are things to be done. But I think they come from different places. It's going back to that conversation about like anger is often a reaction to a different emotion. And while I think it is good to talk about other methods of coping than sort of anger at people or in situations, I think righteous anger is a pretty important force in the universe and holds a slightly different place. So he might be very vitriolic, or he might be having a very reasonable reaction to an injustice. The Pope just recently came to Canada to apologize for what was done at the residential schools.
Yeah.
The families affected by those schools. Some of those people might find that it is helpful in their lives to forgive. And if that helps them, that is wonderful. I don't think any of those people owe the Catholic Church any modicum of forgiveness.
No.
Right?
Charitably, not a bit.
So this could be a negative if this is something that the child attaches to all religion, and can't really see nuance and thinks that anybody who's involved in any kind of religion is doing the kind of harm that was done to his mother.
Mm-hmm.
And that would, I think, probably not lead to the best outcomes in his life and is something that the mom could help address with him.
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's falling more on the righteous anger side, it could lead him to be more likely to stand up to those kind of injustices that he might see in other contexts.
Sure. Start a social movement, start a political action campaign, blog, right? Like I get that. Yes, absolutely. 100%. That sort of stuff can lead to very positive change. And historically speaking, I mean, like the suffragettes were righteous anger, right?
Yeah.
And then
I think about the
19th Amendment, right? Was that the 19th? I think the 19th Amendment.
The kids who were at the high school where the shooting was, who become such incredible activists,
right,
for regulating firearms.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to be careful in discounting young people's ability to, I think, in some cases, see more clearly than their parents.
Well, it also matters what they're being angry at. You know what I mean? Like if you're angry that there's a system in place that oppresses your people or leads to, your friends getting murdered in school, then that is obviously a righteous anger. But I think that's one of the reasons why I'm putting it on the parents first, is that it's up to the parents to help guide the kids to understand that. Like I doubt that David Hogg would have been such a forceful and effective advocate for gun regulation. if he didn't have the ability to guide his own emotions around seeing his friends killed in school. Like he had a very mature response to it. Like, I don't think those sorts of reactions spring up out of nothing. I think that a lot of it, in most cases, has to do with modeling, right? You model, a child learns from modeling so much, so effectively that it's nonverbal. It happens all the time. And if a parent is constantly not maybe expressing these big emotions, but then also processing them and apologizing to their kids when they have an outburst in an effective and compassionate way, where the child understands the outburst and appreciates the response, that leads a child to realize that it's okay to be sad and angry and frustrated and whatever. And it's also okay to have reasoned responses to those big feelings that can lead to, in some cases, reform, like real reform, not just within a family, but maybe at a social or societal level. I don't know. I feel like I'm talking above my pay grade here, and I should shut up now.
No, but that's why I said I truly don't know, because they're very anecdotal, and I think it could 100% go either way. Yeah. But I'd
like to know more about like the actual happenings of those anecdotes, but we're not going to get it, I think.
No.
So it's up to us as secular parents on a podcast to kind of work the grist through the mill.
Yeah. And I typically feel like you do better giving kids more credit than less, I guess I would say.
100%.
And I worry when it feels like it's leaning too far in the other direction.
But it is very common for kids, political and religious positions, to simply be parroting what their parents believe.
Oh, yeah.
Talking to apologists sometimes gets you into that silly conversation that leads to you saying something along the lines of, yeah, well, if you were born in Iran, you probably wouldn't have been born a Mormon. It's highly unlikely that, apropos of nothing, you would have thought of, hey, maybe there's this guy called Joseph Smith, and maybe he found these golden tablets or golden plates buried under this tree in upstate New York, given by an angel, and maybe Jesus was in North America too. And maybe I really believe in Jesus more than Muhammad, and Jesus is really the prophet I need to follow. That's just, if you think that's really a possibility, then, cool, but I can't follow you down that rabbit hole. They're learned. Political and religious positions are they're cultural things. And so, yes, I want to give the kid enough credit to have these sorts of positions on their own. But that's why I think it's important, like you said, to differentiate those like extreme visceral reactions to political or religious positions from that, differentiate those from what we would consider righteous anger, because those sorts that's like railing against some sort of injustice, and kids know injustice when they see it. Take a kid to see a Marvel movie, you'll see when they get upset, and you'll agree with them. It's a very universal sensibility, because we are, as social sentient animals, we all share certain needs. And when those needs are restricted maliciously, we recognize it and we seek to rectify, because we understand the value in cooperation and empathy and compassion, because we know that when those things are practiced by the majority of people, society not only survives, but it thrives. Like, our biggest endeavors are done collectively. And kids know this too. So, So it's like yes and no, way too complex to get in even one podcast. And this one's running long. So I think we just started to scratch the surface of all this.
Yep. Lots more to talk about in the future.
Yeah. But thank you for bringing it up, Mom. That was a good one.
Yeah. So to end things out, just the normal thank yous. The music for this podcast was provided by Jonathan Zalbin and First Frame Music. Always appreciated.
So here ends another episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.